So today we're talking with three of our contributing authors. Kathleen Kuehnast, who wrote the chapter on gender and armed conflict. She is the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And in that position, she makes sure that all USIP programs integrate a gender perspective. She is a cultural anthropologist by training. We have Jeni Klugman, who wrote the chapter on gender security and development and is the managing director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. She's also the lead author of the WPS Index and the recently published US Women, Peace and Security Index. References to these publications can be found in the chat. She's an economist by training. Then we have Ed Carr, who wrote the chapter on gender and environmental security. Ed is professor at Clark University and director of the International Development, Community and Environment Department. And he is a geographer and anthropologist by training. And last but certainly not least, my co-editor and partner in this project, Michael Brown, who is professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, former dean of the school, and for many years he was the managing editor of International Security, the leading academic journal on international security issues. He's a political scientist and international security expert by training. As you can see, a very diverse and very interdisciplinary group. And I think that the diversity of our professional backgrounds and the fact that many of our authors have been engaged with these issues, not only at an academic level, but also at a policy level, has made this such a good book. So you can find the full bios of our panelists in the chat box, where you can also find more information on the book, as well as a discount code if you want to buy the book. So the way I would like to proceed is as follows. I will ask each of our authors 2 sets of questions. In the first round, I would like to focus on the track record, the obstacles, and the drivers to progress. Ask them to tell us about their main findings. And then in a second round, I would ask each of them to briefly talk about their strategies for progress, their recommendations. And then I'd like to open it up for a discussion around the questions that you, the audience, will pose. And you can do that through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I would suggest that, as our panelists talk, you write out your questions in the Q&A function. So let me start with you, Kathleen. Your chapter deals with armed conflict. So when is it that the international community, the policy community, really started to pay attention to the issue of gender, and why? And where are we today? What have been those main drivers and obstacles to integrating a gender perspective? Over to you, Kathleen.
Well, thank you, Chantal, and thank you, Ambassador Yeager, and greetings to all my fellow panelists. So nice to see you again. Well, this chapter really tries to capture 3 major messages. First, I think we need to explain, just because I hope we have a general audience as well as an expert audience, that in the case of using the term gender, we're not just simply using it as another name for women. It's not just about the 23rd chromosome that determines our sex, but gender throughout this book and in this chapter really speaks to the power dynamics and how a society sets norms, expectations, and duties for each sex. And of course, what armed conflict does to disrupt those norms, those rules, those ideas. What we see is really feminist and gender scholars for decades have been contributing to these frameworks, theories of change and good research. And they have particularly argued that war and peace don't necessarily have a beginning, middle, and end, but instead they're really pushing on this idea of the power dynamics in armed conflict between the personal and the public, between the political and the domestic. And thus, gender is much more fluid and is used and manipulated throughout conflicts. We see this, of course, most recently in violent extremism. Violent extremists use gender as if it was a playbook for, bringing men and women into their fold. But the third area that I want to really focus on in my few minutes here is to look at how armed conflict affects men and women differently, and particularly the impact of sexual violence on the civilian population, particularly women. This is probably one of the most gender defining aspects of violence. And certainly in the last 30 years, we have in the policy sphere begun to address it. I recall a former UN peacekeeping colleague noted, sexual violence and conflict is more effective than a bullet and much cheaper. That is just a very stark way of beginning to open that conversation. We have made progress, and I think in the progress category, the issue of celebrating this year or this week, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is really a breakthrough, a landmark way for the world to begin understanding that war is not just about men with guns, but really women who are and civilians targeted in this, but also need to be a key part of the peace and security efforts moving forward. This has been a big win, but we have a long ways to go, and I will certainly pick that up in the next part of our conversation. But briefly, I want to spend just another minute looking at the fact of how sexual violence has really moved us into a way of conceptualizing how this form of violence is not only an act of rape, but as defined in the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court, it also includes a continuum of violent acts and sexual slavery, forced marriage, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, sterilization, torture, humiliation, and other forms of sexualized violence. It is important to name these because we see this going on every day in our globe today. And one of the issues is how to begin to address this in our research. I see that's my 5 minutes, and I'll try to pick up on some of the drivers in my next round.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you for being so concise. Ed, let me turn to you. What are your main findings?
Hi, everybody, and I'd like to also echo Kathleen. Hi to my fellow panelists. Good to see everybody again. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for saying that the book was written without much jargon. That is not often said about things I write, so I appreciate that greatly. Looking at the issue of gender in the context of environmental security, one of the most striking findings in my chapter is that when you look at environmental security, that term, there is shockingly little work that looks at gender and environmental security specifically. In fact, basically, Nicole Detroz is the whole literature. There's almost nobody else really working on this. And that's a big problem for environmental security, because if you're not looking at this, you're not looking at the gendered impacts of shocks and stressors and the gendered ways in which people secure themselves against those kinds of environmental shocks and stressors. You can't also see the gendered implications and impacts of interventions aimed at security. That all disappears. In slightly happier news, as opposed to talking about environmental security, the term, if we look at different subsets of that, so for example, water and security or climate and conflict, you start seeing a bit of variation. There are parts of the field, and I talk about water and security in the chapter, where actually gender has been very thoroughly integrated. And there's actually excellent, deep historical work there done by a wide range of scholars. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we look at climate and conflict, and again, a near total absence of consideration of gender there. So a very uneven space right now with a lot of work to be done. So anyone who's paying attention to this, who might be a graduate student, there are dissertation topics all over the place that you could definitely be working on, and we need people to work on. In terms of drivers of change, one of the things I think is to focus on specific aspects of the environment. That seems to be a lever people were using to bring gender in. Thinking about environmental security very broadly sometimes may get too nebulous for people to be able to tie things down. It doesn't fix everything in this area, but it definitely creates broad opportunities that are needed here to bring gender in. I also think the rise of resilience as a concept in development, in the climate change community, I think it's showing up in the security community. It's often treated as a precondition for security right now by at least some donor organizations. And resilience fundamentally requires people to ask resilience of what, to what, and for whom. And as soon as you have to ask those questions, questions of gender are going to arise for you. So there's a very nice avenue for bringing a lot more of this work in through that. I'll kind of end my section here by saying some of the obstacles that I bring out in the chapter and that still concern me here. What attention there is to gender in this literature often is really oversimplified. That is to say, where you take a place-specific finding about gender and the environment, gender, the environment, and conflict, and suddenly that becomes sort of it's transmogrified into a universal finding because it just gets repeated over and over and over again in policy documents, where it started as a finding about a country and ends as a finding about the world after the third or fourth repetition. And I think that's a major challenge. Another big thing in place here are monitoring and evaluation frameworks by organizations at almost any level. Yes, most monitoring and evaluation work these days demands disaggregated data, I should say, which is good news. But the bad news is it tends to then just divide the humanity into men and women as kind of these big lump categories that doesn't actually take into account all of the different things that are happening within those categories, or even how those categories are defined against one another in different places. All this is really critical for understanding how the world actually works in different places. So this is not only bad for project design, but it's going to hinder our learning from projects, programs, efforts to address security in different parts of the world. I'm going to stop there and pick up with what we might do about some of that in the next section.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. Jeni, you wrote the chapter on gender development and security. What are your main findings?
Well, thank you, Chantal. And I was indeed very happy to be invited to write this chapter linking with development, which I think is seeking to bridge another gap. So there's the gap on the gender and security side. And then I think, as Ed has already alluded to, a substantial gap indeed vis-a-vis the development community. And so what I do in the chapter is analyze a range of development challenges, from economic opportunities to education and health, voice and representation, with a gender and security lens. And an important motivation for the development community to be focused on women, peace and security is that these are very closely correlated. And indeed, you could argue the other way, that folks interested in gender and security should care about development because there are close links there as well. And this graph that Kayla was kindly going to show shows this connection between development and women, peace and security. On the development side, I'm using the Human Development Index, which is a widely recognized measure of development, which goes beyond income to include education and health as well. And then on the x-axis here, the right-hand axis, we have our global Women, Peace and Security Index. And you can see here the overall correlation, which is quite striking. And indeed, a larger correlation than what we find if we just mapped income, for example, against women, peace and security. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that there is a link with GDP, but some countries, including Rwanda, Jamaica and Nepal, do much better on our Women, Peace and Security Index than they do in terms of per capita income. And then on the other hand, in red, you can see Saudi Arabia, Libya, a number of other countries in the Middle East and North Africa doing much worse. So for example, Saudi Arabia dropping some 108 places. Something that we didn't cover in the chapter was COVID, of course, because we finished before the kind of events and challenges of this year have unfolded. But what we also find in more recent analysis, this is my last graph, is just to remind that there is indeed a close correlation as well between a country's ranking on women, peace and security and whether or not they're likely to be able to handle a humanitarian disaster like COVID. So here we can see indeed that there are a number of reasons for us to be concerned about women's position in society. So in the chapter, an important theme is the variation in country settings. On the one hand, it's a universal agenda, but on the other hand, clearly the challenges are much larger in fragile and conflict-affected states, as well as among women, as Ed alluded to, who are marginalized in various other ways due to poverty, ethnicity, and so on. At the same time, when we look at the obstacles to progress, there are indeed common themes behind this country level variation. So many women face overarching constraints in terms of adverse social norms, unpaid household and care work. Again, something that we've seen amplified during the COVID crisis. And these discriminatory norms in many countries also interact with legal barriers. And that's an important theme that we explore in the chapter. I use the OECD's measure of legal discrimination, social discrimination, and to show how those factors hold back women's opportunities in various ways in major parts of the world. And in turn as well, hold back economic opportunities in terms of starting a business, even participating in the labour market. And then finally now, let me just show how this bears relevance to our current circumstances in the US index, which Chantal mentioned, the importance of legal protections again. And I just showed this here as well because it indicates the importance of going behind national averages. We're often in development talking about the country level and making potentially generalizations again based on what we see from national level statistics. What we did in this US index was disaggregate for or construct the index for all 50 states as well as Washington, DC. And here I'm just showing you the findings with respect to legal protections, which I won't go through in detail here. But you can see that there is enormous variation across states in terms of the extent of legal protections of very basic aspects of economic protections, protection against violence in the home, as well as access to sexual and reproductive health. So I hope this has given you an appetite to go and look at the chapter and related work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeni. Michael, before I give the floor to you, I would like to recognize Noël Pourrat from the Carnegie Corporation who joined us. And I'd like to thank Noël and the Carnegie Corporation for the support that they have given this project. And I also would like to give a very special welcome to Stanley Brown. So with that, Michael, in our concluding chapter, we're trying to bring together these different strands in these different chapters. So talk a little bit about our main findings.
Okay, well, it's great to see everyone, and I feel like in this online era, we're getting the band back together, which is fantastic. The most striking thing that we saw in looking at these 10 issue areas is the prevalence of common patterns across issue areas, across regions and countries and over time. This will not be a surprise to scholars who work broadly in the field of gender and security studies. My colleagues on the panel and other people who work broadly in the field know this, but it might be news to those who focus intently on one issue area. especially in the policy world, but also in the academic world, we often get siloed. And we think that our world's the entire world, but in fact, there are some broader patterns going on, and it's important to emphasize and remember that. We have to understand the general context. And we see this playing out in particular with respect to obstacles to progress. And it starts with patriarchy, which Valerie Hudson has called in her new book, The First Political Order. And the first political order is also the longest lasting political order. It's pervasive, it's deeply entrenched and institutionalized and powerful. It's ideational, it's social, it's cultural. And in looking at how that plays out in these different issue areas, we were struck by the fact that there's a combination of general inertia and active resistance. There's general inertia because in any established system or institution or organization and bureaucracy, there's just a tendency to keep doing what you're doing. Aircraft carriers tend to keep moving in the same direction they're moving in. They're hard to turn. But there's also active resistance because established systems and orders want to preserve their self-interests and propagate their self-interest. We were struck by the common tactics that are employed in these male-dominated systems. And as the ambassador pointed out, we put together a table in the concluding chapter where 12 of the most common tactics come up again and again, just ignoring the issue of gender equality, the exclusion of women and girls from positions where they should be gender balanced, tokenism and marginalization, restricting the pipeline, and especially the employment of violence. We see this before, during, and after conflicts. We see it in military organizations. We see it in displaced populations. We see it during pandemics, and we see it in politics. We see it everywhere. It's pervasive. And these kinds of patterns come up again and again. We've also seen common patterns in terms of misperceptions, the constant conflation of women and gender, and the quite regular lumping together of women and children and analyzing different issue areas. Just turning to drivers of progress, again, we see some very common patterns. Almost all the progress that's been made across all these issue areas, and in terms of gender equality and the gender and security in general, almost all of the initiatives come from women. Women plus ed. I mean, basically almost all of the progress that we have seen comes first from feminist and gender scholars, and then more recently over the last 25 years from women activists working individually, working together, the WPS community, getting these issues on the agenda and pushing them forward over the past 20 years. There's now a new generation of scholars who are working on the intersection of gender and security issues. Some of them are established scholars, and there's also a very energetic and fabulous new generation and next generation of scholars working on these issues. But what I find frustrating is that there are very few people who have started out working on security issues, especially traditional security issues, who have then focused on the gender dimensions of these issues. That's still lacking. You see it in the journals, you see it in the field, you see it in the classroom. People who are working in the traditional security field still don't get it. And that's one of the things that we hope this book will do. In terms of drivers of progress, obviously there are allies, and there are progressive national governments, Sweden and Europe in general. Jeni's WPS index shows that 30 of the 50 countries with the best WPS index scores are in Europe, plus Canada, which is an honorary European country. And that in turn has led to some progress in international organizations, especially the UN and the EU, but there's still a very long way to go. The final thing I'll say, though, is that a lot of the progress has come from scholars like my colleagues on the panel, and especially this next generation, which has really taken off over the last 20 years. The field of gender and security studies has now become an established field of scholarly inquiry. That's a very important thing. Scholars like my colleagues and scholars like you out there watching this event today are making a real difference in identifying problems and getting things on the agenda. And that's really key. That's where the academic world and the policy world come together. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. So let's, I want to echo your point about the importance of the next generation. And that's also a part that WIIS is very focused on, and getting that next generation involved and making these connections between gender and security. But let us go to the second round in terms of strategies for progress. Kathleen, I want to start with you again. So what are some of in your particular issue area, some of your strategies for progress?
Well, I think there's several. The first, just to pick up on Michael's good points about, the research and research may be in unlikely places. And I think that's what one of the things this book really contributes to. You've taken the concept of security and helped expand how to integrate gender in areas that we really haven't spent much time on. I'd like the next book to be actually focused on all of the people like engineers and architects and medical field to really take on gender, because these very limited models of only male, female, the binary is really one of our hurdles facing us. But at the same time, we have some spectacular colleagues who are putting forward new theories of change. And of course, it's been referenced, Hudson et al., that, this concept that there is a high correlation into Jeni's great work on, the physical security of women in a country and their relative protection through customary and official laws from domestic violence, rape, and just the overall sense of peacefulness in that country. I think another important part of this story is on its way, and it's beginning to integrate concepts of gender around masculinities. Even in our popular press, we have seen recent conceptions of how various parties look at the sense of, in this case, manhood. These are very important because they start to interrupt and disrupt our notions that sex is built in a certain way. We know as anthropologists, there's 1,000 different derivations on how a society organizes power relations, but our aim cannot be forgotten. This is about gender equality, because gender equality actually affects all of us, not just women. It makes an enormous difference in all societies, and we're beginning to see progress in research there. Just a few last points. Where is there progress? In 20 years, we do have 86 countries in the world that have deliberately developed a national action plan on women, peace, and security. In our own country, the United States, we have a legislation that the government must integrate WPS in their work. We see so many more interactive databases, gender disaggregated data. And I think coming forward is we are going to be focused more and more on this intersecting identity. We could call it intersectionality, but we are not just gendered beings of diverse backgrounds, but we bring so many identities to the story, and that all of these must be a part of our peace and security agenda. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I see Ed nodding vigorously. I mean, during the project, we had several workshops where we sat together, and Ed and Kathleen, as the two anthropologists, were always banding together. So Ed, tell me about your strategies for progress. And I also want you to talk a little bit about, you mentioned the whole issue of resilience and how that has become a sort of, catchword in both academia as well as in the policy world. But there's a danger to resilience and to sort of this notion. We also talk a lot about building back better. So I want you to address that issue as well.
Sure. So let's start through a couple of things. I wanted to also start by saying I appreciate Jeni's presentation a lot, because I do agree that environmental security shades into development, and therefore, if you're worried about environmental security, you're worried about development. So I think these things all sort of fit together in a variety of ways. In terms of the environmental security and gender agenda, my chapter lays out 6 basic strategies for progress here. One of them is to focus, as I mentioned before, on specific environmental resources and stressors. Don't talk about the environment as some nebulous thing. It tends to evaporate all the specificities that we need to bring gender in. I think along with that, the second one was to make place-specific and context-specific decisions about who we're trying to help, or whose needs we're trying to address, whose security we're looking at here. To echo Kathleen, who's made this point more than once already, the third point here, stop using gender as a synonym for women. That comes up far too often in this literature. We have to recognize how men and women, and in some cases other categories, are relational and defined with reference to other characteristics like wealth and age. That was Kathleen's point, I think, about intersectionality there. Fourth point, we have to abandon simplified understandings of gendered relationships to the environment. Simply put, women are not always more vulnerable to a given shock or stressor. What we do know from the literature is that environmental shocks and stressors and conflict, these things when they go together, they tend to amplify existing inequality. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the inequalities in a given society, in a given place where we're concerned about this issue, and how will these sorts of events amplify those existing inequalities? Fifth point, post-conflict work, looking at what you do after a conflict, really does need to take a gender lens on reconstruction, but a gender lens, as I think Kathleen's been pointing to, as I've been trying to lay out, I think as the whole book really lays out. In other words, what is being reconstructed and for whom, and to what end are we reconstructing? Are we just putting things back the way they were? And is that what we really want to be doing, for example, in a lot of contexts? Final point from the chapter was to pay attention to the insecurities that can be caused by transformative environmental security efforts. Yes, the world is in need of transformative change in a lot of places and in a lot of contexts, but such efforts tend to challenge fundamental notions of who people are and how they live in the world. And the conflict potential for shifting those kinds of things at a very small scale in the community, within the household, is very, very high. And I think if we're thinking about gender equality and gender equity issues, we have to pay an awful lot of attention to that. I think, Chantal, that brings me into your point and question about resilience. Resilience has, as I like to say to people, resilience has risen in prominence almost as quickly as it's been emptied out of meaning over the last couple of years. So it's one of these very challenging terms to pin down and define. But to put it really simply, resilience is not about bouncing back to what things were. Even the ecologists don't see it that way. Resilience is the property of a system to bounce back or to transform itself to maintain certain essential characteristics of the system. And as soon as you bring that in, you immediately realize there's either a choice, bounce back to what was, which is a political choice that invokes things like gender and gender roles, or we're making decisions about what are the essential characteristics of the system that must be preserved as we move forward, which again, brings politics in. There's no neutral resilience out there. So this goes into, Chantal, what you're saying about building back better. Who is in that conversation about building back better? Who is making that, who is making those decisions about building back better? Who is making the decision about what is essential? I think these are all central questions that come out of the environmental security and gender questions that we're dealing with in the book and more broadly. And again, this is a relatively open space in the literature, which is kind of shocking. You don't think there'd be too many of those these days, but this is an area where there's a lot of space for a lot of great work to be done.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, in terms of building back better, it should actually be building back differently and not to the way it used to be, which often is the case when policymakers talk about resilience and building back better. Jeni, let me turn to you. What are your strategies for progress?
Well, I think that the multidimensional and persistent nature of the challenges mean that there's no single or simple way to close gaps. And Ed and Kathleen have already, I think, given us important guidance on these fronts. In my chapter, I look at it more from kind of topic point of view. So various areas where efforts either by government, civil society, also international actors have been associated with advances over time. I have a list of 5. Ed had 6, but let me just go through them relatively quickly. I think one necessary but not sufficient is legal reform. You know, where there's persistent legal discrimination, it's very difficult to make progress. Kathleen mentioned laws against domestic violence, which I think can play an important kind of signalling as well as potentially kind of role to prevent violence and signal changing norms. And from a very low base in, say, the 1970s, we now have almost 160 countries around the world which have, at least on the books, laws against domestic violence. But related to that is kind of bridging gaps between norms and laws and practice. And in the chapter, what I do is try and highlight some of the accumulating evidence about efforts to deliberately change norms can indeed bring payoff. So that's an area where development programming is trying to work out, for example, how to work with boys as well as girls in schools and in communities, safe spaces for girls in various post-conflict and low-income settings around the world. And there is, I think, some encouraging evidence from Promundo and other programs where these deliberate engagements can indeed pay off. I also kind of highlight education for girls. I guess in some ways we think of that as kind of a battle won, but I think particularly now in the context of COVID and the risks of reversal, and also the need to continue to be concerned about the barriers facing in particular girls from poor and marginalized kind of families and households, including displaced girls and so on, and ensuring that there are subsidies and incentives to ensure that they can complete, indeed through secondary schooling at least. And then the final 2 that I have are more around echoing some of the excellent points which have already been made around supporting leadership, particularly of girls and young women. And then finally around collective action. And I have some coverage there about the role of technology, which I think plays enormous promise, holds enormous promise. But I also highlight that there are gaps, again, in digital access, again, facing marginalized groups. So there's indeed promise there, but we can't assume that it will always be a force closing gaps and bringing marginalized, excluded groups in. So let me stop there and happy to follow up in any of the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I remind our audience that you can use the Q&A button or function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. But before I go to you, the audience, let me go to Michael. Michael, in our concluding chapter, we come up with sort of 5 main principles that we think, strategic principles that should guide any policy or action in the future. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about our 5P framework.
Well, 5 priorities too.
Right.
People, parity, perspectives, policy, and power are 5 things to focus on. And because of time constraints, I'll just go through this quickly. In terms of people, we think one of the priorities is to expand the focus from women to gender, which many people have talked about, and colleagues on the panel have talked about this today. But I think still in the policy community in particular, there's a tendency to use the terms simultaneously, and we need to develop a genuine gender perspective on these issues, more emphasis on men and masculinities, and more emphasis on LGBTQ people and perspectives, which is still just beginning to get more attention and looking at these issues. Parity and perspectives go together. The importance of universal mainstreaming of gender balancing, 50-50 across the board, across issue areas, across countries and around the world. But there's a general consensus that even if gender balancing is necessary, it's not sufficient. You have to bring real gender perspectives to these issues. And that means having a gender focus when you look at whatever the issue might be, whether it's the 10 issues we're looking at here, or as Kathleen said, if it's architecture and engineering, you need to bring a gender perspective to these issues. And that means having real gender expertise so that you can conduct sophisticated analyses and assessments of these issues, and that involves education and training. Turning to policy, we all know the importance of agenda setting. I would say especially now with the pandemic and the recession going on, I think right now agenda sustaining is going to be key, because right now, in every country around the world, the pandemic and the recession are at the top of the policy agenda. They're at the top of the resource consumption agenda. And right now, continuing to keep the WPS agenda high on the agenda is going to be a challenge, just given where we are in the world. And so sustaining this momentum in the next couple of years in particular has to be a priority. In policy terms, we all know the importance of policy implementation, and resources are the key. And that's also going to be a challenge in 2021 and 2022, when other priorities are just vacuuming up so much of the available resources that are out there. I think for scholars and analysts like us, we need to follow the money. And for activists, you have to keep saying, show me the money. That's the key to getting something done in terms of implementation. And we also need to keep developing the data. As my colleagues have pointed out, we need to have gender disaggregated data, but also trying to expand data on LGBTQI people is going to be essential and harder to do. But if we're going to really expand the gender agenda, we need to do that as well. And finally, that brings me to power. We've referred to this as a struggle over the ultimate balance of power. And I think that's a good way of putting it. Maybe it'll get the attention of some of my colleagues in the security studies field. One of the things I know from studying international issues is that established powers do not give up their power voluntarily or easily. We see this when we look at the rise and fall of great powers. We see this at the national level. Authoritarian leaders do not give up power voluntarily as a general rule. And I think that's the way we need to think about this struggle for gender equality as well. Yes, we need to have the data that will help us to analyze these issues. Yes, we need to analyze these issues from a gender perspective, but we should not assume that data analysis and sweet reason is going to bring about the change that we want to see in terms of gender equality. It's a struggle for power. And I think that means, especially in the next year or two, we need to be prepared to play defense, because so many other issues are going to rise to the top of the agenda. That means consolidating the gains that have been made. And I think a year ago, we were all hoping and expecting that 2020 would be a springboard year for the WPS agenda, that in the 20th anniversary and the 75th anniversary of the UN, that would be a springboard that would give us some bounce into the 2020s. And I don't think we're going to get the bounce we were hoping for because of what's happened in the world. We need to consolidate the gains that have been made, and we need to keep pushing this on the agenda for the 2020s. And the final point I'll make is that we, in addition to playing defense, we have to play offense, and we need to do both things at the same time. In the long term, that means building up capacities. And I won't go into that here. If you want to read more about it, Jeni's chapter does a fantastic job of how we can build up capacities in terms of education and capacity building in general. But we also have to play offense in terms of the narrative. And what I see happening right now is almost a perfect storm of trouble. We've seen a rise of neo-patriarchal leaders in countries ranging from Brazil and the Philippines and Turkey to the United States currently. We've seen the rise of far-right patriarchal misogynist ideologies. I've been reading about the alt-right, and it's just terrifying, the view that they have toward women and LGBTQ people. We need to dominate that narrative and shape that narrative, because the third part of the perfect storm is the pandemic and the recession, which is just creating structural challenges for all of us. But I think one thing we can do is to try to drive the narrative, and especially in this era of social media, that's really key. And that's one of the things that we can do, even though we might not have a lot of resources at our disposal. And right now, when I look at the US political campaign, and there's a group called the Lincoln Project, which is a group of former Republicans who are playing hardball in terms of the campaign. And I think basically we need a Lincoln Project for the WPS movement to play hardball on the narrative at a time when we really have to play hardball in terms of defense and offense. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions related to how we decided on the topics in the book. There's a question from Noël Pourra on, noticing that there is actually not that much literature on the intersection of gender and security, and whether there is an increase of demand by potential consumers for this kind of research, whether this book will provide a resource that universities are already looking for, or does the existence of the book provides them with a needed tool to convince more universities and professors to integrate these issues into the curricula. And then there are also a number of questions about masculinities. In terms of the topics, why we decided on these topics, we thought that we wanted to keep this a limited book, an accessible book. And so we thought that these were some of the main security challenges, both in the traditional security sphere as well as in the non-traditional or the human security sphere. So that's why we decided on these issues. And in terms of what we hope to achieve with the book, I think we do hope that universities will use this book in their curriculum, and that it will help them think about how to integrate gender perspectives in these issues. And maybe I can invite, our academics here to say a few words about that. And then Kathleen, maybe say a few more words about the whole issue of masculinities, because whenever we talk about gender, and it even happens to us, we often focus on women because they are, of course, the ones that are most marginalized and are suffering from the gender equality that exists. So how can we bring in a masculinities perspective? Maybe we'll do that first round and then I'll have a second round. So Ed, Michael and Jeni, maybe, you know, that it's really important to integrate gender perspectives in the academic curriculum.
Thanks, Chantal. Thanks for the excellent set of questions. No, indeed, I think the book is great because it covers such a range of topics. I think that you've, you know, it does represent kind of the state of evidence and thinking across the different areas. So it's a great kind of jumping off point. You know, it's clearly not going to be, I mean, for example, on the development one, it's clearly not the last word, but hopefully it's something that provides an accessible overview, either at the undergraduate or the graduate level, which would then enable kind of deeper dives into different areas and more, you know, whether it be a thesis or just a paper, you know, there's still a lot to be done. So speaking personally, my goal is to kind of attract and excite people about the agenda and allow for the additional kind of thought, consideration, and accumulation, I think, of more evidence, including on what works to advance the agenda to help to accelerate progress. So I see it as a way of kind of building bridges and kind of opening up the tent, if you like, because I think that one thing that at least some of the areas have suffered from a little bit is a sense that it is kind of unique, it's very particular and not necessarily very accessible. So I think by kind of drawing the commonalities, including the way that you and Michael did in the opening and closing chapters, helps to kind of increase the preparedness for people to engage and take the agenda forward in different shapes and forms. You know, I mean, I think we have some useful common templates here, but it's going to happen in all different, you know, settings and permutations, which I think is great as well. Thank you.
Ed?
Echo most of what Jeni said. I think I don't know what I set out to write in the chapter, but when I realized that there was a lot less in the space than I'd expected, that chapter turned into actually kind of a conscious effort to point to where the work could go, the spaces into which it could go. So sort of to echo Jeni, yes, there was a bit of a, this is not the last word intentionally. This is sort of a taking on of, I think this is kind of what we've seen up to this point, but hey, everybody, these are the ways you could go quite easily. And this is space that we need to fill with scholarship. And so hopefully that's something that does come out of my chapters, that people do go to fill those spaces, because it's, again, in my chapter, just a tremendous amount of work that could be done.
Michael, do you want to add something? I would say there is also a huge demand from, I think, your students. I mean, I see young people who are really interested learning about these issues. Michael?
Yeah, and that's growing. And I think in terms of courses, one of the keys is we do have specific courses focused on gender and security issues, and I'm teaching a course on that this semester. And it's great that places like GW and Georgetown and Clark and other great universities are all expanding their list of courses that have gender in the title. But it's also important to mainstream gender in courses that don't have gender in the title, our intro and survey courses. And I've been doing this when I teach Intro to International Affairs or an International Security Core course, and we need to do this more across the board. In comparative politics, American politics, and in other disciplines as well. And let me just say, in terms of the topics of the chapters and the topics that we picked, Karen Johnston has a question on population movements. And luckily we have a chapter on population movements by Jane Friedman, and she's not with us today, but she's definitely in the book. She wrote an outstanding chapter on refugees, migration, displaced people, and trafficking. We don't have a chapter on pandemics because of space constraints as much as anything, but Jeni's chapter does a fabulous job of talking about some of the underlying development issues And we do have a chapter by Tamara Nair on humanitarian emergencies, which doesn't focus specifically on pandemics, but a lot of the problems and a lot of the lessons related to humanitarian emergencies apply specifically and directly to pandemics, which essentially are humanitarian emergencies of a specific type.
So
Chantal, I think you're muted.
I think I just muted my. So Kathleen, we see this issue all the time when we're talking about the women, peace and security agenda, when we're talking about gender, most of the time people just think about women. How can we overcome that? I mean, we're trying to do that in the book here, I think, to also look at masculinities and how notions of masculinities are infused in our institutions, etc. But you know, there is that sort of barrier. How do we overcome that?
Well, I think we overcome it by really understanding our definitions, because certainly just like gender is not another name for women, masculinity is not another name for men.
Right.
To your good point, Chantal, we all inculcate the dominant narrative. And in most of the world today, the dominant narrative is a masculine, male-oriented, whether it's through education, religious, groups, sports, you can find it everywhere. And first of all, bringing awareness, women learn those narratives and reproduce them. And because women are still the primary caregiver, they reproduce it in their parenting as well. So it is a catch-22, but I think awareness, education, I would call out Norway here. They teach gender in their middle school and high school as a conceptual understanding of how human societies organize themselves. In particular, I think it has a huge role moving forward in the peace and security field, because it isn't, as you say, enough to say, yes, women are victims of war and women should be at the peace table. We have to understand that during war, great disruption of these ideas about gender, there's an opportunity, there's a window of opportunity to rewrite gender norms versus repress them or regress them. We see both. And of course, this moment in time, which has already been mentioned, COVID and the economic downswing, is a very double-edged sword for the progress women have made in rights. And we need all of us in our best masculine ideas and best feminine ideas to make the progress moving forward.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I think you make a very good point. And of course, also, as Michael said earlier, you know, gender is ultimately about power and how that power is distributed within society. And so that's important. I want to do a closing round of questions. And that is this Thursday, we will have the open debate on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And if you were invited to come and talk to the UN Security Council, what would you say to the members of the Security Council? And so I'm asking you not so much maybe on the long-term strategies on which we focus in the book, but what are some of the immediate and maybe more short-term, real concrete policy recommendations you would want to make if you would given the chance to present to the UN Security Council this week? Ed, can I start with you?
Sure. Maybe I'll throw two things out. One kind of really concrete and then one maybe as a tactic. So a concrete thing, short term, if that's what you're talking about, we should probably change our data collection standards and really expect more than just gender disaggregated data, but start to push on what more complex data collection standards might look like that are actually going to enable more and interesting kinds of work around these topics pretty broadly. That's like a very short-term mechanical thing, but it would enable a lot. Strategically, I'm struck by some stuff that Michael said a little while ago, thinking about sort of maintaining an agenda, especially the notion of maybe having to play offense. I've found myself in the space of playing offense on these topics a lot in the environment and development spaces. And I think that one of the arguments you make at a time like this is better work on gender results in better use of the limited funds you have and better outcomes with those funds. So if you're in a time where you're resource constrained, this is not a side investment. This is a central investment to still bring about the kinds of impact you want in the world. So I think that that's something that really does apply a lot right now as an argument that people are going to have to make, because there will be efforts to sideline this as somehow not as central as some other kind of issue. So those would be sort of small and then big suggestions.
Great. Kathleen?
Yeah, I would thank you, Ed, for that really good idea about change data collection standards. That was like close to my number one as well. I want to talk about transforming the social contract, and I'll throw a wild card out here, because really when we're talking about armed conflict, we're talking about violence and this concept that you know, violence, whether there's war or no war, exists, and how we're going to tackle violence as a global community. And I would want, if I had the magic wand, I would eliminate corporal punishment in all religious institutions, educational institutions. Start with a law, because if you are victim as a child of violence, and we've seen this in the Promundo research, the chances that you will commit violence is 1.5 times more likely. We have to begin to look at our normalization of violence and the way we control the youngest among us, the shortest among us, the most vulnerable.
Okay. Jeni?
Those are hard acts to follow. So I'm sure that it'd be tricky if I was third in front of the Security Council after Ed and Kathleen. But I was going to say two things. Well, I agree very much with the suggestions before. I was going to underline the importance of ensuring integration of gender into COVID responses. I think that Michael's point is very important. Sorry, I have a cat. You know, in terms of world preoccupations, but it's not an either or thing. You know, I think we still need to push for, you know, just because we are responding to COVID, but why is it that most of the people being infected are women? You know, even if they're not the majority who are dying, why are women pulling out of the labor force in unprecedented numbers? Last month, it was 1 million Americans withdrew from the labor force. 800,000 of them were women. So, you know, it's not like COVID doesn't have gender dimensions. So I think firmly underlining that, I think in terms of responses across the board, not only on the obviously economic, but other sides as well. And then the other one that I was going to say, because it came out, I guess, very starkly in the reviews of UN Women and others, is the importance of space and protection for collective action, including women human rights defenders, which was very much under threat, I think, in recent years and still at the fore now. And I know that was an important theme of some of the preparatory work, you know, when we thought this was going to be a big year on reviewing the Beijing platform and so on. But I think because we know that women activists have played such an important role, both in advancing as well as in protecting women's rights, you know, I think that the Security Council, given its political kind of power and force, is an important place to be reinforcing that message. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael?
Thanks. Well, yeah, I have a triply hard act to follow. I was just looking at the membership of the current UN Security Council because I wasn't sure who the other 10 were. It is not a bad group in terms of Jeni Klugman's WPS index. But when I look at the P5, most of the P5 is a problem. I'm looking at you, Russia, China, and the current US administration. And I guess what I would say to member states at the UN and the Security Council is that there might be a tendency right now to say, pandemic, recession, we don't have time for these secondary issues. We don't have time for this nice normative stuff. We have to focus on these other priorities. And echoing my colleagues, I would say, look, this is not just a matter of doing the right thing, it's doing the smart thing. And if you understand, anything about economic development issues, recovering from pandemics, as Ed and Jeni and Kathleen have pointed out, the smart thing to do is to invest in women and girls. This is a very smart play for nation states right now. And, not just trying to build back better, but building back in a fundamentally different way. As Rahm Emanuel said, you never want to let a major crisis go to waste. And this is an opportunity to do the right thing and the smart thing at the same time. And I guess the second thing I would say to the UN Security Council, and I know that there are some female ambassadors at the UN, but I would, in general, when you're looking at national policy establishments, you're still looking at male-dominated establishments. And I guess what I would say to men everywhere is that when it comes to gender equality, as Walt Kelly said some 50 years ago, we have met the enemy and he is us. And we have just got to do a better job. And right now, I think a lot of the narrative is going in the wrong direction. There's been a pushback to the progress that has been made on women's rights and gender equality issues. And men in particular have just got to do a better job. We have got to be better people. And developing that narrative as a long-term, multi-decade, multi-generational project, but we have to focus on it.
Thank you very much. Let me add just one maybe recommendation for the UN Security Council. Kathleen mentioned earlier on the national action plans, and the national action plans have been actually very important instrument to mainstream the women, peace and security agenda, as well as the gender equality agenda. And so we have now 86 national action plans. They are a little bit all over the map. Not all permanent members of the UN Security Councils have an app, China, Russia, including some Security Council wannabes like India. So I think all countries should be encouraged to have an app, in particular those on the Security Council. And I would like actually to have the Security Council ask the UN Secretary General to put together a group of experts and give states greater guidance on these national action plans, particularly when it comes to implementation, because that has been, a refrain throughout, that implementation has been lacking. I want to thank all of you, my colleagues, Ed, Jeni, Kathleen, Michael, Ambassador Kurt Jäger. I think this was a terrific discussion. And I hope all of you, the audience, will go and buy the book. As I said, there is a discount code available for you. And I look forward to seeing you at one of our next policy roundtables on gender, peace, and security. And again, thanks very much. Also, thanks to my WIIS colleagues, and particularly Kayla McGill, who has been working hard behind the scenes. So thank you and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.